Good afternoon. I'm Paul Hines. I am Vice President in charge of activities, and you all are part of history. This is the first time at any lunch we've had this many people here, had to seat everyone else for lunch and then bring them in and to make you have tickets. It's a real tribute, though, of course, to our presenter and the organization he represents. I would like to call forward now the man who runs this club's Glee Club, our music director, Paul Weldy. Will you please rise and listen to the national anthem?
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you, Paul. What a beautiful voice. The gentleman who is going to introduce our speaker is a very active member of this club, will be soon going on the board of this club. He is the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. I present to you Edward G. Bainey.
Thank you, Paul. It is a genuine pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Most of you are familiar with Alan Greenspan's distinguished career as chairman of the Federal Reserve since 1987, as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the mid-70s, as chairman of the National Commission on Social Security Reform in the early 80s, and is the head of the Townsend Greenspan Economic Consulting Firm for many years. I will not belabor his numerous accomplishments and awards. Let me instead mention two or three of Alan's many abilities that I find most striking. One is that I don't think Alan has ever met a piece of economic data he didn't like. Data that he didn't want to examine in more detail. I have spent a number of years in the Federal Reserve myself, and before I met Alan, I thought I knew something about economic data. But soon after he joined the Fed, I heard him analyze data at a level of detail that I didn't know even existed. I've seen staff make very thorough presentations only to find that the chairman has gone one better and found yet more data to analyze on the issue at hand. You've heard praise for people who can see the trees without losing sight of the forest. Alan is a person who sees the forest and the trees and also sees the branches, the leaves, and even the twigs. Then he has the remarkable ability to put all of those details back together into a more meaningful view of the forest. In addition to his analytical ability, Alan is a person who truly listens to others. More than most people I have worked with, he patiently takes in what others have to say and seeks to understand and assimilate the various perspectives that are offered. I've come to appreciate how his ability to listen has served the country well. Of course, in addition to being someone who listens, Alan is someone worth listening to. His wealth of knowledge and experience on a broad range of issues makes his views particularly valuable to us all, which is one reason why he has been appointed Fed chairman by 3 different presidents. It's true, though, that Alan's skill at communicating is sometimes challenged. In response to one senator's question about the future direction of interest rates, he said, "If I say something which you understand fully in this regard, I probably made a mistake." I hope you did not come here today to hear a Fed chairman talk about interest rates, because Fed chairmen don't do that, at least not in plain English. But if you came to hear about a major economic issue of our time, then you have the opportunity to hear one of the most knowledgeable Fed chairmen, indeed one of the most knowledgeable public servants we have ever had. Alan's talk today focuses on entitlements and Social Security, a topic he has had a special interest in since he chaired the National Commission on Social Security Reform. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Alan Greenspan.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I must say that Ed Bainey's description of the forest, the trees, the leaves, and the twigs sort of got to me. I don't know what branch of economics he was involved in, but it must have been something terribly significant. I really am delighted to be at the Union League for the first time in over 40 years. I used to spend a good deal of time here with friends, and was delighted to hear at lunch that one of them, Walter Morgan, whom I knew in, I guess, 1953, 1954, fairly well, and always considered him sort of an elder statesman when I was a mere child, is still alive. And spring chicken is not precisely the way I would currently be described. But I must also say that I'm also gratified to learn that your organization remains as vital and active as it was in the 1950s, and I think that's really quite extraordinary for any institution in this country over such a period in which our institutions, mores, culture, and all related evidences of society have changed so dramatically. Today I would like to address an issue, as Ed mentioned, which really will be at the forefront of American concerns over the next decade and doubtless beyond, specifically our largest federal entitlement program, Social Security. It's becoming conventional wisdom that the Social Security system, as currently constructed, will not be fully viable after the so-called baby boom generation starts to retire in about 15 years. The most recent report by the Social Security trustees projected that the trust funds of the system will grow over approximately the next 15 years. However, beginning in the year 2012, the annual expected costs of Social Security are projected to exceed annual earmarked tax receipts, and the consequent deficits are projected to deplete the overall trust funds by the year 2029. While granted such evaluations are based on uncertain future, the benefit per current retiree under existing law, adjusted for inflation, can actually be forecast with some precision over the next 30 years. There are very few things that economists can project with any precision for a 10, 15, 20-year period of time. And in the Social Security area, we have a few of them. The so-called real benefit, which is what is locked into law in constant dollars, is very easily projectable because it's very simply a matter of projecting dollars on the basis of a specific formula. And obviously, we know with some degree of accuracy the number of retirees that will exist 10, 15, 20 years from now, largely because most of those people are ending their careers in business or whatever work activity they were engaged in. And we know pretty much from the demographic point of view how many people will be on the Social Security rolls. So unlike most types of government statistics and most types of data with which we deal, the Social Security system is largely forecastable to a greater or lesser extent relative to other types of activities, specifically Medicare, which I will get to towards the end of my remarks. The projection of the per capita costs for future retirees is estimable with somewhat less precision, but we still have got some reasonable judgments on that. The price escalation of benefits, of course, is far more difficult to pin down because it tends essentially to require a fairly good insight into long-term forecasts of price inflation. And we have demonstrated over the years as economists that our ability to do that is less than terrific. But since price inflation has an equal effect on wages subject to Social Security taxation, for all practical purposes, the degree of inflation does not have a large direct effect on the net funding of the system over the longer run. Obviously, the rate of inflation, because it affects the overall economy, presumably does affect the real wage base, that is adjusted for inflation, from which Social Security taxes and future benefits are derived. The projection of inflation-adjusted taxes, which are subject to a wider degree of uncertainty than total benefits, is largely driven by real wage growth, that is, wage growth adjusted for inflation, which in turn is primarily determined by the growth of productivity. Projecting productivity in line with the pattern of the last quarter century suggests a trend of revenue falling far short of the levels required to finance the benefits of the large baby boomer bulge in retirees anticipated to start about the year 2010. I should state parenthetically that if recent productivity trends are underestimated, as I strongly suspect they are, for much the same reasons, the same reasons that productivity the data are underestimated, we also would be underestimating both real benefits and real payroll taxes, which means that we will find that the total funding shortfall is about the same, which means that the system is not essentially sensitive in its evaluation to a lot of potential variations in numbers. The real future funding shortfall is not materially affected by any of these. Our Social Security problem is thus not merely statistical. It is the consequence of a projected shortfall in real resources dedicated to Social Security. In money terms, the current Social Security Trust Fund of $500 billion falls far short of the levels required to fund the current obligations to pay promised benefits to those already retired and those who will retire in the years ahead. Social Security, unlike fully funded private retirement programs, is largely an intergenerational transfer. Today's workers are essentially paying for today's retirees. Under the current system, the Social Security benefits paid to today's workers when they retire in the future will be primarily dependent upon the payroll taxes acquired from future workers. Accordingly, if the Social Security system is to survive in its current form, either real benefits must be curtailed or real taxes increased. The latter can come from either higher tax rates or higher real wage growth, in effect, higher productivity growth. However, as I will be explaining shortly, higher productivity is unlikely alone to do the trick. Moreover, increased Social Security tax rates, of course, are controversial in that many perceive them, myself included, to adversely affect employment. A primary cause of Social Security's funding imbalances stem from the fact that until very recently, the payments into the Social Security Trust Fund accounts by the average employee, plus employer contributions and the interest earned on both employer and employee contributions, were inadequate at retirement to fund the total of retirement benefits. In effect, you could not buy an annuity with the proceeds of all of your taxes and all of the interest that is received on those taxes. You could not buy an annuity which would give you, in years past, anything close to the value of the benefits which are paid out in the Social Security program. And needless to say, this then creates a very large unfunded liability, which were it a private system, private insurance, would be very difficult to finance. Since it's a public system, it can be made to work, as indeed it has been since its inception in the 1930s. However, the pattern of shortfall or imbalance between what people pay in and what they pay out has started to change. Under the most recent revisions to the law, the presumably conservative economic and demographic assumptions, and under those assumptions, today's younger workers will be paying Social Security taxes over their working years that appear sufficient to fund their benefits during retirement. However, the huge unfunded liability for current retirees as well as for much of the workforce closer to retirement, leaves the system as a whole badly underfunded. As longevity improved far beyond that contemplated by the creators of the system, and as productivity growth slowed after 1973, the original premise of the system of intergenerational balance began to fail. Today, the official unfunded liability for the old age, survivors, and disability funds, which takes into account expected future tax payments and benefits out to the year 2070, has reached a staggering $3 trillion. And that number, if one were to project it beyond the year 2070, continues to expand. The Social Security trustees currently project taxes and benefits under existing and of necessity quite tentative economic assumptions that imply that fully funding Social Security for the next 75 years would require an immediate and permanent increase in Social Security taxes of about 2.2 percentage points of taxable payrolls on top of the current 12.4% tax rate, assuming that such an increase would not impede economic growth. Of course, benefit reductions of a similar magnitude or a mix of tax hikes and benefit cuts could also bring the system back into long-term actuarial balance, at least statistically. These types of program adjustments, which on the surface seem quite modest, might nonetheless be perceived as transforming what has until recently been a largely popular, subsidized intergenerational transfer system into something quite contentious. Moreover, the longer action is deferred, the greater will be the necessary tax increases, or more likely, benefit adjustments acquired to achieve the goal of long-term actuarial balance. Clearly, something has to give. The question is what? We cannot hope to grow our way out of the problem. An immediate and sustained increase in annual productivity growth of about 2 percentage points apparently would be needed to close the long-term funding gap without an increase in taxes or a cut in benefits. The improvement in productivity growth must be this large because higher productivity raises future benefits as well as current and future tax receipts. However, given that we struggle to devise economic policies that might raise productivity growth by a few tenths of a percentage point per annum, a gain of 2 full points seems beyond the reach of credibility. Nonetheless, this issue does underscore the critical elements in the forthcoming debate, since it focuses on the core of any retirement system, private or public. Simply put, unless Social Security taxes increase, or as I just indicated, more likely, benefits are adjusted, domestic savings must increase. Potential beneficiaries must further abstain from consuming all of their incomes. Enough must be set aside over a lifetime of work to fund the excess of consumption over any non-Social Security income a retiree must still employ. At the simplest level, one could envisage households saving by actually storing goods purchased during their working years for consumption during retirement. Even better, the resources that would have otherwise gone into the stored goods could be diverted to the production of new capital assets, which would cumulatively over a working lifetime produce an even greater quantity of retirement goods and services. In short, we would be getting more output per worker, our traditional measure of productivity, and a factor that is central in all calculations of long-term Social Security trust fund financing. Hence, the bottom line in all retirement programs is physical resource availability. The finance of any system is merely to facilitate the underlying system of allocating real resources that fund retirement consumption of goods and services. The basic premise of our current largely pay-as-you-go Social Security system is that future productivity growth will be adequate to supply promised retirement benefits for current workers. At existing rates of saving and investment, this is becoming increasingly dubious. Accordingly, there are a number of initiatives, at a minimum, that will surely have to be addressed. As I argued at length in the Social Security Commission deliberations of 1983, with only marginal effect, some delaying of the age of eligibility for retirement benefits will become increasingly pressing. For example, adjusting the full benefits retirement age to keep pace with increases in life expectancy would keep the ratio of retirement years to expected lifespan approximately constant and would help to significantly narrow the funding gap. One of the issues which was not contemplated when this whole program was put together in the 1930s, and indeed when it was continuously augmented as we moved through the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and even into the 70s, was the notion basically that we would expect that the ratio of the number of years that people were in retirement to the number of years that they were working would remain roughly stable, in that you would put certain number of years of work and effort and contributions into the fund, and so long as the number of years you were working were sufficiently large relative to the number of years in which you were retired, then the system would remain viable. But very fortunately, we've had some really quite extraordinary advances in our medical professions and in our whole healthcare system, which has created a surprisingly unforecastable increase in life expectancy. Everything which is good apparently has some negative effects, and what this has done clearly is made the funding of the system, if we maintain the age of 65 as the cutoff point between contributions and retirement benefits constant, we will run into an ever-increasing funding problem. So what I argued back in 1983, and I've been arguing since, is the more sensible way to do this is basically to index life expectancy as the vehicle which determines when one gets full retirement benefits at retirement. And if you can keep that balance, you can keep the system actuarially sound for quite a significant period of time. Hopefully, other modifications to Social Security benefits also will be judged as necessary. Moreover, it is becoming increasingly recognized that the Consumer Price Index overstates increases in the cost of living, and thus indexing Social Security benefits to the CPI goes far beyond the intent of the Congress to insulate retirees from inflation. In that regard, the recently released report from the Boskin Commission makes a valuable contribution to the emerging consensus on this issue. But unless future taxes and/or benefits are sufficiently adjusted, there is no substitute for increased domestic savings and investment currently. To be sure, for relatively short periods of time, we can finance part of domestic investment in plant and equipment with foreign savings, as we are doing today. History, however, tells us that there is a limit to how far that can go. We are also apparently increasing the productivity of our capital. It is possible that the maturing of emerging technologies and further substantial deregulation of industry and finance will in themselves improve the growth rate of productivity without large capital investment and savings. But it would take implausible improvements in capital productivity from current rates to close very much of the Social Security funding gap from this source. The necessary boost in domestic savings need not be derived from an improved Social Security system, but certainly a reduction in the Social Security funding gap would itself move in that direction. In a sense, it would create a virtuous cycle with higher savings engendering higher productivity growth, which in turn would narrow the funding gap still further. Of course, additional savings can be achieved through a reduction in the overall federal government budget deficit and intensified efforts to encourage private household and business savings. There is essentially no way that one can envisage a significant increase in the retired population, especially as a ratio to the number of working age people, and have them maintain a reasonable standard of living without a significant increase in savings and therefore investment, the investment in turn creating the acceleration of goods production, which is basically the only mechanism in which you can support a very large population of retired people in a society in a civilized manner. The human race has never had to deal with this problem because life expectancy, as you all know, for virtually all of our existence was really quite minimal, and it is only in recent decades that there has been, as a consequence of major changes in our medical capabilities, that has enabled us to create this statistical, financing, economic dilemma. Recognizing that and recognizing how important it is to plan ahead, it is absolutely essential that we move in a direction sufficiently far in advance to enable us to address a problem which one can see, as poorly as we can see into the future, we can nonetheless see this problem emerging in a way which no other major economic problem confronting the United States allows us to perceive. I might say parenthetically, we have a problem here. But when you look at Europe, and especially Japan, the issue becomes even more evidently difficult. And so what has occurred is the extraordinary expansion of life expectancy is going to force us, all of us, both the United States, Europe, Japan, and as the emerging countries begin to become highly industrialized, they too. It's going to force us all to recognize that the level of savings and investment in our societies, if we are going to maintain viable standards of living for our growing retired populations, must rise. Some have argued for a provision in law to require the Social Security trust funds to invest in higher yielding private securities especially equities, rather than in U.S. Treasuries only. A higher rate of return, it is alleged, would help solve the Social Security funding problem. That may in fact be the case, but it is important to trace through all of its implications and specifically ask what would happen in that event to the private retirement program system. If Social Security trust funds are shifted in part or in whole from U.S. Treasury securities to private debt and equity instruments, holders of those instruments in the private sector must be induced to exchange them net for U.S. Treasuries. If, for example, Social Security funds were invested wholly in equities, presumably they would have to be purchased from the major holders of such equities. Private pension and insurance funds, among other holders of equities, presumably would have to swap them for treasuries. But if the Social Security trust funds achieved a higher rate of return by investing in equities than in what they currently hold, lower yielding U.S. Treasuries, then private sector incomes generated by their new asset portfolios, including retirement funds, insurance funds, and the like, would have to fall by the same amount, potentially jeopardizing their financial position. This zero-sum result occurs because of the assumption that no new productive savings and investment has been induced by this portfolio reallocation process. Proceeding still further, one must presume that in such a circumstance, in order to induce the private sector to exchange their equities for treasuries, equity prices must rise and bond prices fall. But this would create great market tension. Bonds and equities are merely the paper claims to income-earning assets, and the value of the income stream in the corporate and general business sector is not determined by short-run changes in the supply and demand for securities. Rather, equity prices must, in the long run, reflect the underlying earnings of the corporations on which the equities are a claim, as well as society's need to be compensated for postponing consumption into the future and its perception and attitudes toward risk as a consequence of uncertainty about the future. Indeed, the total market value of debt plus equities is, to a first approximation, likely to be unaffected by the shift in the balance of paper claims. Corporations overall may issue any types of securities they like, but the total value of the institution, the market value, which is measured by the stock value plus any bond or borrowing value, is determined by the productiveness of the company and how much income it gets and its underlying productivity. The shifting of paper claims, how much one issues or how much one buys, has effects at the margin for a short-term period, but it does not affect the fundamental value of a company. One might expect that this tension, this market tension, between the altered relative supply of stock and debt claims on the one hand and unaltered overall economic value of the nation's companies on the other hand, would be resolved by an increase in the issuance of equity securities relative to bonds. This could reverse much, if not all, of the price shift in favor of equities. However, to complicate the issue still further, it is not clear as to whether and to what extent bond prices would rise as corporations cut back on debt issuance. Certainly with the Social Security trust funds no longer investing all of their surplus in U.S. Treasuries, the federal debt held by the public would rise, presumably placing downward pressure on bond prices. At best, generally, the result of this restrictive form of privatization, that is, the particular recommendations to enhance and fund our Social Security system by the purchase of stocks and bonds in the private sector, which yield more as distinct from U.S. Treasuries, those results are very distinctly ambiguous. And the presumption that there is a resolution of our system simply by some shuffling around of how one invests Social Security trust funds without a recognition of the secondary and tertiary consequences, I think leads one down a road which ultimately is particularly vacant. Thus, the dilemma for the Social Security trust funds is that a shift to equity investments without an increase in domestic savings may not appreciably increase the rate of return of Social Security trust fund assets. And to whatever extent that it does, it would merely be mirrored by a comparable decline in the incomes of private pension and retirement funds. I should stress that this does not mean that at least a partial privatization of our Social Security system does not provide a potentially viable solution to current funding problems. There are a number of thoughtful initiatives that through the process of privatization could increase domestic savings rates. These are clearly worthy of intensive evaluation. Perhaps the strongest argument for privatization is that replacing the current unfunded system, which apparently discourages savings, with a fully funded system, is that such a change could boost domestic saving. But in any event, we must remember it is because privatization plans might increase savings that makes them potentially viable, not their particular form of financing. The types of changes that will be required to restore fiscal balance to our Social Security accounts in the broader scheme of things are significant but manageable. More important, most entail changes that are less unsettling if they are put into effect in the near term rather than waiting 5 or 10 years or longer. Minimizing the potential disruptions associated with the inevitable changes to Social Security is made all the more essential because of the pressing financial problems in the Medicare system, Social Security's companion program for retirees. Medicare currently is in an even more precarious position than Social Security. The financing of Medicare faces some of the same problems associated with demographics and productivity as Social Security, but faces different and currently greater pressures owing to the behavior of medical costs and utilization rates. Reform of the Medicare system will require more immediate and potentially more dramatic changes than those necessary to reform Social Security. We owe it to those who will retire after the turn of the century to be given sufficient advance notice to make what alterations in retirement planning may be required. As I said before, the longer we wait to make what are surely inevitable adjustments, the more difficult they will become. If we procrastinate too long, the adjustments could be truly wrenching. Our citizens deserve better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Greenspan, for a very informative presentation. And Ed was correct, not a mention of interest rates. The stock market is safe for another day. I would like to invite forward the president of the Union League, Robert W. Miller, to make a very special presentation. Bob?
Thank you, Paul. This is a particularly enjoyable function for me today for two reasons. One is it comes at the end of my term as president of the Union League. 4 days from now, I join that very exclusive club known as ex-presidents of the Union League. But a second, even more personal reason, the fact that Alan Greenspan and I were colleagues in the Ford White House in 1974 and 1975. He was up here as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and I was brought in to run an economic summit conference that President Ford presided over, because at that time we were terribly concerned about inflation. Now, just to show you how difficult it is to forecast economics, by the time we got to the conference, 4 months later, inflation was not only the problem, we were worried about deflation. And we were stuck with thousands of win buttons called Whip Inflation Now. You may remember that. Alan told me at lunch I should save mine. They may be valuable someday. The history of the Union League is the history of Abraham Lincoln, to an effect. We were founded to support the Union Army, as you well know, during the Civil War. And we revere Abraham Lincoln with his portrait in that magnificent statue in Lincoln Memorial Hall. During Bob Flood's administration, the board authorized the development of the Abraham Lincoln Award, using his name to recognize significant contributors to our society. And it mandated that replicas, miniatures of our magnificent statue be made as the symbol of that award. And it determined that the purpose of that award was to honor people who have made major and significant contribution to the betterment of our entire nation. And certainly Alan Greenspan is one of those. And I have the privilege today of presenting only the third of the Abraham Lincoln Awards. The first one was presented in this hall when we had a crowd nearly as big as this. We had a parade down Broad Street when we welcomed home the troops from Desert Storm. And Bob Flood presented the first award to General Walter Boomer, who headed the Marine Corps in Desert Storm. Now I have the opportunity to present only the third in this series, to a man that we all know by reputation, who we all revere and honor, and a man whose contributions we all appreciate, because his magnificent leadership of the Federal Reserve System has helped maintain the stability of our economy, and all of us are the beneficiaries of that. And he's led the Federal Reserve System through some very turbulent times and steered a very straight and narrow course, for which we are all very appreciative. It is my great honor now to present to Alan Greenspan the Union League Abraham Lincoln Award.
Thank you very much. I'm quite privileged to accept the award, and I already have a bust of Abraham Lincoln sitting in my office, and I think that I know exactly where next to that bust that ought to go, and I think I really consider it a major privilege to be so honored today, and I thank you all.
And thank you all for being with us. We're adjourned.
We don't want to carry back in the